Every day, over 10 children are reportedly sexually abused in Pakistan. Every year, we bandy about these statistics in order to get the public's attention. These numbers might get your attention, but they are not accurate. During our work on the ground in Kasur and Sheikhupura, we realized that reported cases of child sexual abuse just barely scratch the surface. The vast majority of these cases go unreported. And so the numbers are woefully inadequate when it comes to explaining the systemic and cultural issues that lead to child sexual abuse and the reasons why it continues to persist.
The problem is we have gotten child sexual abuse completely wrong. We have given it a face, the face of a predator. We think that when the predator is caught, our issue will be resolved. We believe that when the abuser is publicly hung, our children will be safe. However, this is only the tip of the iceberg because child sexual abuse is so rampant and so ingrained in our society that at least 1 out of every 6 people we interviewed in Kasur and Sheikhupura said that they were either sexually abused as a child or knew someone who had been.
Yeah, so these conversations were part of a study that we conducted in Kasur and Sheikhupura under the Safer Society for Children project that we co-founded. During these, we wanted to identify the extent of child sexual abuse, gauge what people already knew about the problem, and devise a curriculum that would introduce localized preventative measures for parents, teachers, children, police officials, and healthcare workers. We chose these 2 districts because they had the highest reported instances of abuse. But when we began, we didn't realize just how many unreported cases of abuse we would come across.
Our work with these communities tells a story of a culture that passively permits abuse. Conversations about sex are absent, and parents don't have the words to talk to their children about sex and sexual abuse, which means our families do not have the conversations about these issues at home. Further, children from an early age are groomed to never say no to an adult, especially if that adult is a close relative or family friend. And therefore, when someone like this attempts to abuse them, children hesitate to say no and they hesitate to tell their parents.
Now, these lack of conversations also mean that very young boys often drift into places like snooker clubs, where they have access to things like pornography and drugs. They can also access porn through their mobile devices at home. Most of their mothers are not tech savvy, and so they get easily flustered when they see the access their children have to this adult content. The boys, when they witness or experience something, do not have the language to be able to talk about what has happened or the confidence to broach a trusted adult with the conversation. And on the other hand, this inadequacy of language means that girls are not taught to protect themselves. And when a case of abuse occurs, they blame themselves and feel so ashamed that they refuse to reveal what has happened to them.
This leads directly into our second problem, how abuse is perceived in our society. A standard definition of abuse by any psychologist or expert will classify abuse as an act by a perpetrator, but also a failure to act by a parent or caregiver. This failure to act is missing from our understanding of abuse. During our work, we have come across families who have completely twisted and myopic definitions of abuse.
So, for instance, in Sheikhupura, we met with a 10-year-old girl and her mother. According to the mother, this girl had been raped by a 12-year-old boy from the neighborhood. When we began to gently probe and ask more questions, we found out that the boy's father had shown him pornography prior to the incident. The girl's mother had seen both children, beaten up both children, and then neglected to seek any kind of medical help for her daughter. The community that they belonged to correctly identified rape as a form of abuse, but they could not see the father's act of showing pornography or the mother's neglect as forms of abuse. But there were 3 instances of abuse in this example, not 1.
In Kasur, we spoke to a woman whose 13-year-old niece had been raped and subsequently became pregnant. She was too scared to tell anyone, and by the time her parents found out, she was already showing. Her mother took her to a local dai for an abortion, and because of her medical incompetence, the child's uterus exited her body along with the fetus. Only then, when she was bleeding out, did the mother take her to a local hospital, where she eventually died. Again, the community recognizes rape as abuse, but failed to recognize the act of placing this child's life in the hands of an incompetent hack to cover up this crime as abuse.
Now, the purpose of sharing these examples with you is not to say that the families of these victims share equal parts blame with the perpetrators of the crime. We share these examples because we believe that to show you that our collective understanding of abuse is inadequate and that this inadequacy can endanger lives. Things like exposure and neglect can lead to more serious forms of abuse, like rape, but we need to understand that they are forms of abuse in and of themselves, and they need to be treated with the seriousness that they deserve.
Emotional trauma is as real as physical trauma. A sexually abused child may not show visible signs of trauma, and it may remain repressed and unresolved as they grow older. It creates unhealthy coping mechanisms and thought processes. We have seen how neglected and abused children may go on to become perpetrators themselves because they could not deal with the trauma of their childhood. And therefore, we need medical and psychological interventions right when an incident happens.
Yeah, we need to stop neglecting abused children and pretending that as they grow up, they're going to forget about it. In the news, we see instances of grown men who were abused as children going on to rape and murder children. And when this happens, we pretend that it is an isolated, sickening act of a psychopath, and we decide to intervene by asking for the death penalty. But the time for intervention is now.
To address this issue, both the two problems we've identified, the lack of communication and the narrow understanding of abuse that leads to heightened vulnerability and unresolved trauma, we devised the Safer Society for Children program. We need to equip parents and children with the words they can use. We need to ensure children know about their private parts, the rights over their own body, and that they can have a conversation with a grown-up about an unwanted touch without feeling guilty.
So, after consulting with multiple pediatricians, psychologists, and child protection agencies in Pakistan, the US, and South America, we came up with a set of highly structured materials that would guide parents through these conversations. Our participants learn how to talk to their children about their bodies and abuse. They learn about the different signs of sexual abuse, such as age inappropriate sexualized behavior, bedwetting, and sleeping problems. They also learn about the different avenues they have to report a case of abuse once it occurs and how they can intervene as adults.
An example of this material is the flashcards that you see here. These flashcards are accompanied by a set of structured questions that parents can ask their children or teachers can ask their classroom. They delve progressively into this topic, starting from identifying private parts to safe, unsafe, and unwanted touches, to learning how to say no and reporting to an adult. Supporting materials like these are publicly available and also include coloring worksheets, guidebooks for teachers, and handouts for parents. We also have instructional guides on how you can organize these workshops in your communities or institutions. You can access this content on our website.
We've also translated all of this content into Urdu and Punjabi, and we hope to continue doing so into more local languages. We've also developed a set of rigorous impact evaluation tools that will assess the behavioral change in all of our workshop participants. And finally, you will notice that all of these materials are sensitive to gender and age, so that younger children are given simpler language, and boys and girls are taught what is culturally relevant for them, given the socio-cultural conditioning they receive in these areas. I really wanted to point this out today because we believe it is time to rid ourselves of this notion of global best practices. It is time we develop local best practices, which may borrow from international expertise and literature, but they need to come primarily from conversations with people on the ground who are most affected by the problem.
And finally, there is a last problem that we have to address on a societal level. The burden of prevention should not lie with families alone. Teachers, doctors, nurses, and all other professions in which adults come into contact with children should be able to recognize signs of abuse and know how to intervene or report accordingly. Right now, parents have full and final say over what happens to their children, and the rest of society willfully turns a blind eye. This means that there are limited calls about cases to helplines that do exist. We need to start reporting cases, and we need systems that respond when we do.
These systems can't be built overnight. But if we can equip the wider community to recognize, respond to, and report abuse, we can begin this push for a more robust system. Reporting abuse can become the trigger for wider societal and institutional change. So we need all of you to collectively think of yourselves as being responsible for the safety of the children around you.
To address this issue, we are also introducing our basic 2-hour online course modeled on the mandatory reporter trainings in the US. It teaches professionals like yourself on how to recognize signs of abuse, both for an abused child and an abusing adult, and what constitutes abuse, both the acts of a perpetrator and the failures of caregivers.
So let's begin these conversations. Let's equip ourselves and our children with the language and the knowledge they need to prevent abuse. Let's work together as a community to make a safer society for children. Thank you.
Thank you.